I felt the trigger move, and nothing answered back, while the orders still held me in place. The cold and the mud worked into my rifle, and the delay became mine to carry. My superiors wanted restraint, not the seconds slipping away in my hands. When the bolt finally moved, the ground in front of me had already changed. In the winter of 1944, Allied ground forces in Italy were engaged in a slow grinding campaign against well-prepared German defensive lines. By January, the fighting had settled into a pattern defined by cold rain, mud, and limited visibility. The Italian peninsula offered few wide fronts and fewer opportunities for rapid maneuver. Infantry units advanced by short bounds, often measured in meters rather than miles, and progress depended as much on discipline and endurance as on firepower. On the morning of 22 January 1944, elements of the United States Fifth Army were positioned south of Rome, holding ground taken after weeks of incremental advances. The broader operational situation was tense but static. German forces had withdrawn to prepared positions, relying on interlocking fields of fire, artillery observers, and the terrain itself to slow Allied movement. For American infantrymen, the daily reality was dominated by patrols, sentry duty, and the maintenance of weapons under conditions that made proper care difficult. Within one rifle squad of an American infantry platoon, routine preparations began before first light. The men were positioned along a shallow ridgeline overlooking a narrow valley. The ground was saturated from days of rain, and the temperature hovered just above freezing. Fog settled low in the folds of the terrain, limiting visibility to a few dozen meters. There was no immediate expectation of contact, but German patrols had been active in the area, probing Allied lines and testing reactions. The squad leader, a staff sergeant with several months of combat experience, moved quietly among his men as they checked their equipment. His responsibilities were not dramatic. He verified fields of fire, ensured that watches were set, and reminded the men to keep their weapons clean and dry as best they could. Like many non-commissioned officers, he spent most of his time managing small details, knowing that failures in those details often carried consequences far greater than their apparent importance. One of the riflemen in the squad was tasked with covering a shallow draw that cut across their front. It was a likely avenue of approach for enemy movement, though nothing suggested an imminent attack. The rifleman, equipped with an M1 Garand, had been in Italy for less than 3 months. He had completed training in the United States and in North Africa, but his combat experience was limited to brief engagements and long periods of waiting. Before dawn, he performed a routine function check on his rifle. The weapon had been cleaned the night before, though the available materials were limited. Lubricants thickened in the cold, and fine grit worked its way into every mechanism. He cycled the action slowly, listening for irregular sounds, and then let the bolt go forward. The rifle appeared serviceable. At higher levels of command, the morning's orders were straightforward. Units were instructed to maintain their positions, avoid unnecessary engagement, and report any enemy movement. Aggressive action was discouraged unless contact was clearly established. This was consistent with the broader operational plan, which prioritized holding ground and preparing for coordinated advances rather than reacting to every minor enemy probe. As the first light crept over the ridgeline, the fog began to thin. Shapes in the valley below became marginally clearer. The rifleman focused his attention on the draw, scanning slowly, careful not to silhouette himself against the sky. His posture reflected training and repetition rather than tension. After weeks at the front, vigilance had become habitual. Several minutes after dawn, subtle movement caught his attention. At first it was indistinct, a shift in shadow, a brief interruption in the uniform gray of the landscape. He adjusted his position slightly and continued to observe. The movement repeated, this time more clearly. A small group of figures appeared to be moving along the draw, keeping low and using the terrain for cover. The rifleman did not fire immediately. Orders emphasized identification and restraint. German patrols often attempted to draw fire to locate Allied positions, and premature engagement could invite artillery or mortar response. The rifleman signaled the squad leader, who moved into position beside him and observed through binoculars. The figures below were distant but identifiable. They wore field gray uniforms and moved with practiced caution. Their numbers were limited, likely a reconnaissance patrol rather than an assault force. The squad leader considered the situation carefully. Engaging the patrol could reveal the squad's position and draw retaliatory fire. Allowing it to pass risked the enemy gaining information about Allied dispositions. He radioed the platoon leader with a brief report, describing the movement and requesting guidance. The response was measured and consistent with standing orders. The squad was to observe, but not engage, unless the patrol approached within effective range or demonstrated hostile intent. The rifleman maintained his aim, finger indexed along the trigger guard. As the patrol moved closer, he adjusted his sight picture, aligning the front sight with the lead figure. His breathing slowed, and the world narrowed to the mechanical process he had practiced countless times. When the patrol reached a point that the squad leader judged to be within acceptable engagement range, he gave a quiet verbal order to prepare to fire. The rifleman took up the slack on the trigger and applied steady pressure. The rifle did not fire. The trigger moved, but there was no report, no recoil. The rifleman froze momentarily, then instinct took over. He attempted to cycle the action, pulling the operating rod to the rear. It resisted movement, stopping partway. He applied more force, then less, trying to diagnose the problem without taking his eyes fully off the target area. The squad leader noticed the delay. He watched as the rifleman struggled with the weapon, then shifted his attention to the rest of the squad. Other men were ready to fire, but no order had been given. The German patrol continued moving, now partially obscured by terrain. The rifleman finally managed to pull the operating rod fully to the rear. An unfired cartridge ejected, tumbling into the mud. He released the rod, allowing the bolt to slam forward, chambering a new round. He realigned his sights, but the moment had passed. The patrol had halted briefly, then altered its route, moving out of the draw and into heavier cover. No shots were fired by either side. Within minutes, the German figures disappeared from view. The squad remained at alert, waiting for possible retaliation or further movement. None came. The platoon leader was informed that the patrol had withdrawn without contact. Higher command acknowledged the report and reiterated the standing orders. For the riflemen, the incident left a lingering unease. Weapon malfunctions were not uncommon, but experiencing one at a critical moment underscored a reality that training could only partially prepare a soldier to face. The squad leader addressed the issue quietly, instructing the rifleman to disassemble and clean the rifle again once conditions allowed. As the morning wore on, the fog lifted further, revealing a landscape marked by shell craters, broken stone walls, and abandoned farm structures. The squad settled back into routine observation. There was no immediate sense of failure, only the recognition that something small had not functioned as expected. At the level of the squad, the incident was noted and then absorbed into the larger pattern of daily operations. There were no reports filed specifically about the malfunction, no reprimands issued. The orders had been followed, contact had been avoided, the line held. Yet within the squad, the delay lingered as an unspoken point of reflection. The rifleman cleaned his weapon with particular care, conscious of how little margin existed between readiness and vulnerability. The squad leader reviewed his decisions, weighing restraint against opportunity. The operational situation remained unchanged by midday. Units along the front continued to hold their positions, awaiting further instructions. The broader campaign pressed on, indifferent to individual moments that did not register at higher levels. As the day progressed, the squad resumed its watch, aware that the next encounter might not allow for hesitation, malfunction, or delay. By late morning on 22nd January 1944, the sector held by the American platoon showed no immediate signs of renewed enemy activity. Reports from adjacent units suggested similar conditions: intermittent German reconnaissance, no sustained contact, and continued emphasis from higher headquarters on holding positions rather than provoking engagement. The broader Allied operation unfolding elsewhere along the Italian coast did not alter the immediate reality faced by infantrymen along this quiet stretch of front. Within the squad, routine resumed, but the earlier incident subtly affected behavior. The rifleman whose weapon had malfunctioned was reassigned temporarily to a secondary observation position while he completed a more thorough cleaning of his rifle. This was not a disciplinary measure, but a practical one. Non-commissioned officers understood that confidence in equipment was essential, particularly in small unit actions where individual weapons often determined outcomes. Weapon maintenance in the Italian winter was a persistent challenge. Mud clung to boots and uniforms, and moisture seeped into metal surfaces despite repeated efforts to keep equipment dry. The M1 Garand, though generally reliable, was sensitive to improper lubrication and contamination. Manuals advised careful cleaning and minimal oiling in cold weather, but conditions at the front rarely matched those described in training publications. As the riflemen worked methodically, the squad leader reviewed the platoon's defensive layout. He adjusted positions slightly, ensuring overlapping fields of fire and reinforcing sectors that had limited visibility. These adjustments were minor, but they reflected a growing awareness that German patrols were testing the line with increasing frequency. Shortly after midday, the platoon received a radio update indicating that enemy movement had been observed farther east. The information was vague, consisting of reports from observation posts and intercepted radio traffic. There was no change to orders, but the message reinforced the need for readiness. In the early afternoon, weather conditions shifted again. Low clouds moved in from the west, bringing intermittent drizzle. Visibility decreased and sound carried unevenly across the damp terrain. For infantry units, such conditions favored infiltration and small-scale enemy movement rather than organized attacks. At approximately 1400 hours, the squad detected renewed activity in front of their position. This time, the movement was less cautious but still deliberate. 2 German soldiers appeared briefly at the edge of the same draw observed earlier that morning. They paused, scanned the ridgeline, and then withdrew. Their actions suggested observation rather than engagement. The squad leader again reported the contact. The response from platoon headquarters remained unchanged. Observe, report, do not engage unless directly threatened. This guidance reflected concern about ammunition conservation, artillery vulnerability, and the possibility of revealing positions prematurely. As the afternoon progressed, similar sightings occurred at irregular intervals. Small enemy elements appeared, paused, and disappeared. None advanced aggressively, and none drew fire. The cumulative effect, however, was an increase in tension at the squad level. Each appearance forced decisions about readiness, restraint, and timing. The rifleman, now back in his original position, felt the weight of these moments acutely. He tested his rifle repeatedly, cycling the action quietly, checking the chamber, and verifying the function of the unblocked clip. The weapon appeared to function normally, but the earlier malfunction remained in his thoughts. Late in the afternoon, another German patrol emerged, this time closer and moving more directly toward the American line. The squad leader observed them carefully, noting their spacing and direction of travel. They were no longer merely skirting the draw, but appeared to be probing the slope leading toward the ridge. The platoon leader was informed. After a brief exchange over the radio, he reiterated the existing orders but added a conditional directive. If the patrol closed further or attempted to establish a position within the draw, the squad was authorized to engage. This clarification shifted responsibility downward. The decision to fire would rest with the squad leader, based on his assessment of enemy intent and proximity. Such delegation was common in infantry operations, but it placed significant pressure on non-commissioned officers to balance initiative with obedience. As the patrol advanced, the squad prepared. Men adjusted their positions, set their sights, and confirmed sectors of fire. No one spoke above a whisper. The sound of rain on canvas and helmets filled the spaces between movements. When the German soldiers reached a point roughly 70 meters from the American position, they halted again. One knelt, appearing to examine the ground or consult a map. Another scanned the ridge with binoculars. The squad leader judged that the patrol was now within effective range and potentially gathering actionable intelligence. He gave the order to engage. This time, multiple rifles fired almost simultaneously. The sudden crack of rifle fire shattered the quiet that had dominated the day. The rifleman's weapon functioned properly, discharging a round and cycling smoothly. He fired again, then shifted his aim as the patrol reacted. The German soldiers dropped into cover, returning fire sporadically. Their response was limited but disciplined. Shots snapped overhead, striking rocks and earth behind the ridge. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Then, abruptly, it ended. The German patrol disengaged, withdrawing back into the draw and disappearing from view. No further movement followed. The squad ceased fire and resumed observation. No casualties were immediately apparent on either side. The platoon leader acknowledged the engagement and instructed the squad to remain alert for possible follow-on action. For the rifleman, the successful functioning of his weapon during the exchange brought a measure of relief, but it did not erase the memory of the earlier failure. He was acutely aware that the outcome might have been different had the patrol advanced more quickly or in greater numbers. As evening approached, reports filtered in from neighboring units. Several had experienced similar contacts, with brief engagements followed by enemy withdrawal. There was no indication of a coordinated attack, but the pattern suggested deliberate reconnaissance under fire. At higher levels of command, these incidents were assessed against established doctrine. German defensive tactics in Italy often emphasized reconnaissance and limited probing to identify weak points before committing larger forces. Allied commanders were cautious about overreacting to such actions, mindful of the risk of artillery response and the constraints imposed by terrain. For the infantry squads on the line, doctrine translated into repetition. Each contact reinforced the need for readiness, restraint, and adherence to orders. At the same time, each moment of delay or malfunction highlighted the narrow margins within which these units operated. As darkness fell, the squad prepared for night operations. Night brought increased risk of infiltration, and watches were doubled. The rifleman was assigned to an early watch, his attention fixed once more on the draw that had dominated the day's events. There was no immediate enemy activity after nightfall. The line remained quiet, punctuated only by distant artillery and the sounds of movement along the ridge. The squad maintained its positions, aware that the pattern observed during the day might repeat or escalate without warning. Within the structure of the unit, the events of 22nd January were recorded as minor contacts, consistent with ongoing operations. No special attention was given to the brief weapon malfunction or the moments of hesitation that preceded the afternoon engagement. At the level of the individual and the squad, however, those moments carried greater weight. They underscored the gap between training assumptions and field realities, between prescribed doctrine and the unpredictable behavior of weapons, weather, and human judgment. As the night deepened, the squad settled into a tense routine, waiting to see whether the day's probing actions would remain isolated incidents or form the prelude to something more sustained. The night of 22nd January passed without direct contact, but it was not quiet. Artillery fire echoed intermittently from positions farther north, and flares rose at irregular intervals along the front. These were routine sounds, familiar to units that had spent weeks holding exposed ground. Still, they reinforced the sense that the line was being tested, even if no immediate assault followed. By early morning on 23rd of January 1944, the squad was fatigued. Watches had been long, sleep fragmented. Cold had settled into clothing and joints, and the dampness never fully receded. At first light, the men conducted the same checks they had performed the previous morning. Weapons were inspected, ammunition redistributed, and positions reviewed. The operational situation remained unchanged on paper. Orders from battalion emphasized continuity, hold ground, maintain observation, report movement. No indication was given that the area was about to become a focal point. Yet the accumulation of patrol contacts suggested that German units were paying close attention to this section of the line. The squad leader took particular care in assigning positions that morning. He kept the rifleman with the previously malfunctioning weapon in his original sector, not as a test, but because familiarity with terrain mattered. The rifle had functioned properly since the cleaning, and there was no justification to remove him from a role he understood. As daylight increased, the fog lifted unevenly. Visibility improved in some areas while remaining limited in others. The draw in front of the squad was partially visible, its contours more clearly defined than the previous day. This clarity reduced uncertainty, but increased exposure. At approximately 8:30 hours, movement was again detected. This time, it was not a small patrol. Several German soldiers appeared at staggered intervals, moving cautiously but in greater number than before. Their spacing suggested coordination rather than independent reconnaissance. The squad leader observed quietly, counting figures and noting their direction. He estimated at least a reinforced patrol, possibly the forward element of a larger group. He relayed this information to the platoon leader, emphasizing the increased number and more deliberate movement. The reply was delayed. Radio traffic was heavy across the sector, and communication was intermittent. When the platoon leader responded, the guidance remained cautious. The squad was to continue observing and avoid engagement unless the enemy advanced further or initiated contact. This response reflected broader concerns. German units were known to draw fire deliberately, using small forces to fix Allied positions, while artillery or heavier weapons were brought to bear. Engaging too early could expose the squad to indirect fire without achieving a decisive effect. As the German soldiers moved closer, the margin for restraint narrowed. The patrol reached positions similar to those occupied the previous afternoon, but did not stop. Instead, they continued advancing, using folds in the terrain to mask their movement. The squad prepared again. Rifles were brought to bear, and firing sectors confirmed. The rifleman focused on a narrow opening between rocks where the terrain forced movement into a confined path. He adjusted his stance, mindful of recoil and sight alignment. The squad leader hesitated. The patrol was now clearly within effective range, but it had not yet demonstrated overt hostile action. No shots had been fired. The men below moved steadily, without rushing or hesitation. Doctrine emphasized fire discipline and identification. Yet doctrine also assumed functioning equipment and predictable responses. The squad leader weighed these considerations in silence, aware that delay could allow the enemy to occupy better positions. He made an informal adjustment. Without issuing a general order to fire, he instructed 2 men, including the rifleman, to be ready to engage specific targets if the patrol crossed an identifiable terrain feature, a low stone wall marking the edge of cultivated ground. This was not a formal deviation from orders, but it represented a shift from passive observation to conditional readiness based on immediate judgment rather than centralized direction. When the lead German soldier crossed the stone wall, the rifleman took up pressure on the trigger. The sight picture was clear. The distance was shorter than the previous day. He waited for the squad leader's signal. It did not come. Instead, a burst of fire erupted from the German position. The initial shots were not well aimed, but they were unmistakably hostile. Bullets struck the slope below the ridge, sending fragments of stone and dirt upward. The squad leader reacted immediately, ordering return fire. The engagement began abruptly, without the measured timing of the previous afternoon. The rifleman fired. The first round discharged normally. He fired again. On the third trigger pull, the rifle failed to cycle fully. The bolt moved partially rearward and stopped. The spent casing did not eject. Training dictated immediate action. He struck the operating rod handle sharply, attempting to drive it rearward. It resisted. He applied force again, this time shifting his grip. The weapon remained jammed. Around him, the squad was fully engaged. Other rifles and an automatic weapon fired in controlled bursts. The sound was sharper and more sustained than the previous day's brief exchange. The rifleman dropped slightly behind cover, focusing on clearing the malfunction. He attempted to lock the bolt to the rear, then to strip the clip manually. The mechanism did not cooperate. Mud and grit had worked their way into the action again, despite cleaning. Seconds passed. The squad leader noticed the reduced fire from that sector and shifted another rifleman to cover the gap. He did not address the malfunction directly. There was no time. The German soldiers returned fire more effectively now, their shots closer and more frequent. The engagement intensified, no longer resembling a brief probe. The enemy appeared intent on holding ground and pressing forward incrementally. The rifleman finally succeeded in forcing the bolt open. The jammed casing ejected weakly, falling near his knee. He reloaded, chambered around, and resumed firing. By that point, the engagement had evolved beyond the squad's initial expectations. The German element did not withdraw immediately. Instead, additional movement was observed farther back, suggesting reinforcement. The platoon leader, now aware of the sustained contact, requested support from higher headquarters. Artillery was not immediately available, and the platoon was instructed to hold its position and assess. As the firing continued, The earlier hesitation and equipment failure took on new significance. The delay at the start of the engagement had allowed the enemy to establish more stable positions. The cost of that delay was not dramatic or immediate, but it was tangible in the increased difficulty of the fight. The squad held, adjusting positions under fire. The rifleman, now acutely aware of his weapon's limitations, fired carefully, conscious of every movement of the bolt and every change in sound or resistance. By late morning, the engagement stabilized. The German advance slowed, then halted. Fire diminished on both sides, replaced by sporadic shots and cautious observation. The line held, but the situation was no longer routine. The events of the morning marked a shift from observation to sustained contact, and from doctrinal clarity to improvised response shaped by terrain, equipment, and judgment. The squad remained in position, waiting for the next instruction, aware that the choices made in moments of delay had already influenced the course of the fight. By early afternoon, on 23rd of January 1944, the engagement had settled into a tense standoff. Both sides occupied shallow cover, exchanging occasional fire but avoiding overt movement. The terrain between the ridge and the draw had become a contested space, marked by churned earth and scattered stone fragments. No formal ceasefire existed, yet the rhythm of combat had slowed as each side assessed the other. At the platoon level, the situation was becoming more complicated. The earlier assumption that German activity consisted only of probing patrols no longer held. Reports from adjacent platoons indicated similar patterns: limited advances, followed by sustained pressure rather than immediate withdrawal. This suggested a coordinated effort to test the line and potentially fix Allied units in place. The platoon leader requested clarification of intent from company headquarters. The response reflected the tension between established doctrine and unfolding reality. Battalion intelligence assessed the activity as local action, not the prelude to a larger offensive. Units were instructed to maintain positions, conserve ammunition, and avoid unnecessary escalation. Withdrawal was not authorized. For the squad on the ridge, these instructions translated into endurance. The men remained in their positions, alternating between observation and brief exchanges of fire. The cold and damp continued to sap strength and concentration. Food was limited to what could be eaten quickly and quietly. Water was consumed sparingly. The squad leader moved along the line when possible, checking on each man. His demeanor remained controlled, but his decisions reflected a growing awareness that formal guidance did not fully account for the conditions on the ground. He adjusted spacing between positions to reduce vulnerability to concentrated fire, and quietly shifted ammunition between men based on expenditure. The rifleman with the malfunctioning weapon continued to fire, but his confidence was diminished. Each shot was followed by an instinctive check of the bolt's movement and sound. He limited his rate of fire, prioritizing deliberate shots over volume. This caution reduced the likelihood of another jam, but also constrained his contribution during moments of heavier contact. Shortly after 1400 hours, German fire increased briefly. Several rounds impacted closer to the ridge, indicating improved range estimation. One round struck a rock near a foxhole, sending fragments outward. A rifleman suffered minor injuries from stone splinters, but remained in position. The squad leader reported the escalation and requested permission to reposition slightly to a more defensible line. The reply from platoon headquarters was firm: positions were to be held. Any movement risked exposing flanks and creating gaps along the line. The order reflected concern about maintaining continuity rather than improving local conditions. This response marked a point of friction. At the squad level, the limitations of the current position were evident. Fields of fire were partially obstructed, and the enemy appeared to be adapting. Yet authority rested higher, and deviation carried its own risks. The squad leader complied, but he made further unofficial adjustments. He directed one man to prepare an alternate firing position a few meters back, not as a withdrawal, but as a contingency. He did not report this change. It was a practical measure, rooted in experience rather than instruction. As the afternoon wore on, the German element attempted limited movement again. 2 soldiers advanced cautiously toward the stone wall that had served as a reference point earlier. Fire from the ridge forced them back, but not before they had gained marginally better cover. The engagement remained contained, but the cost of earlier delays became more apparent. The enemy now occupied positions that were more difficult to suppress. Each attempt to dislodge them required greater effort and increased exposure. At approximately 1600 hours, company headquarters issued a new directive. Units were to prepare for possible relief after nightfall, depending on the broader situation along the front. No timeline was given. Until then, positions were to be held. The prospect of relief offered some reassurance, but it did not resolve the immediate problem. The squad still faced an active enemy element at close range. Ammunition was sufficient but not abundant. Fatigue was setting in. As dusk approached, light conditions deteriorated rapidly. Shadows lengthened and depth perception diminished. This favored infiltration and short-range movement. The squad leader adjusted watch assignments, pairing men to maintain vigilance. During this period, the rifleman experienced another minor issue with his weapon. The bolt hesitated briefly during cycling, though it completed its movement without fully jamming. He cleared the rifle and reloaded, but the incident reinforced his concerns. He informed the squad leader quietly. The squad leader acknowledged the report without comment. There was little he could do. Replacing the rifle was not feasible under current conditions. The focus remained on maintaining the line. As night fell, German fire decreased, replaced by sporadic movement sounds in the draw. No clear targets presented themselves. The squad maintained fire discipline, avoiding blind firing that might reveal positions. Around 1900 hours, the platoon leader relayed updated instructions. Relief was likely but not guaranteed. Until confirmation arrived, units were to continue holding and report any significant enemy movement. The squad settled into a night posture. Watches were rotated more frequently to manage fatigue. The rifleman, now on a secondary watch, remained alert but acutely aware of his weapon's behavior. He kept the action as clean as possible, wiping exposed surfaces and minimizing unnecessary movement. The broader implications of the day's events began to take shape. What had initially seemed like a minor delay caused by a single malfunction had contributed to a chain of adjustments and reactions. No single moment was decisive, yet each influenced the next. The accumulation of small constraints, weather, terrain, equipment, and orders, had narrowed the squad's options. At higher levels, reports would likely frame the day as a routine defensive engagement. The line had held. Enemy probes had been repelled. No ground had been lost. Such assessments were accurate within their scope. At the level of the squad, the experience was more complex. The cost of adherence to doctrine in the face of changing conditions was not measured in dramatic losses, but in sustained pressure and increased risk. Authority provided structure, but it did not eliminate uncertainty. As the night deepened, the squad remained in place, listening for movement and watching the darkened draw. The enemy did not advance further, but neither did they withdraw completely. The situation remained unresolved, balanced between restraint and necessity. The rifleman adjusted his grip on the Garand, feeling the worn wood and cold metal. The weapon was still serviceable, but its limitations were now part of his calculations. He understood that if contact resumed, there would be little margin for hesitation. The squad leader maintained his watch, aware that the decisions made earlier in the day would continue to shape their position until relief arrived or conditions changed. The fight had not escalated into a larger action, but it had exposed the quiet cost of delay and the constraints imposed by orders that did not fully reflect conditions at the front. The night passed slowly, each hour marked by careful observation and restrained movement. The outcome of the situation remained uncertain, not because of dramatic developments, but because of the steady pressure exerted by an enemy that had learned the shape and limits of the line. Relief arrived in the early hours of 24th of January 1944. It was not announced with ceremony or precision. A message passed quietly down the line indicated that another platoon would take over the position before dawn. The handover was conducted under cover of darkness, with minimal movement and no use of lights. Each position was identified by touch and whispered instruction, fields of fire, known enemy locations, and suspected avenues of approach when passed along in brief, practical terms. The squad withdrew carefully, moving in pairs to avoid drawing attention. No enemy fire followed. The German element in the draw had either withdrawn during the night or chosen not to interfere with the relief. By the time first light approached, the squad was several hundred meters to the rear, assigned to a temporary rest area near a ruined farmhouse. There was no sense of conclusion, only pause. The men were exhausted, wet clothing was replaced where possible, and weapons were cleaned again, more thoroughly this time. The rifleman disassembled his M1 Garand completely, laying out the parts on a poncho. Mud and grit were visible in places that routine cleaning had not reached. He worked slowly, methodically, aware that the weapon would likely be returned to service within hours or days. The squad leader reported to the platoon leader, giving a factual account of the engagement. The report noted sustained enemy contact, no confirmed casualties, and successful holding of the position. The weapon malfunction was mentioned briefly, without emphasis. It was recorded as a mechanical issue under adverse conditions, resolved in the field. At company level, the incident merged into a broader pattern of activity along the front. Intelligence summaries described increased German reconnaissance and limited offensive action, consistent with efforts to disrupt Allied preparations elsewhere. No specific conclusions were drawn from the engagement on the ridge. It did not alter operational plans or prompt changes in doctrine. Within the institutional framework of the Army, the events were unremarkable. Equipment failures were expected. Delays occurred. Orders were followed. The line held. From that perspective, the system had functioned as designed. For the individuals involved, the meaning was more personal and more restrained. The rifleman did not speak much about the malfunction afterward. He adjusted his habits instead. He became more attentive to cleaning, more cautious about lubrication, more deliberate in handling the weapon under stress. These were quiet adaptations, not formally taught but widely practiced among experienced infantrymen. The squad leader carried forward a similar adjustment. He remained disciplined in following orders, but he relied more heavily on conditional planning and informal preparation. He identified reference points more carefully, assigned contingencies more explicitly, and trusted his judgment in moments when guidance was necessarily general. Neither man would later describe the engagement as decisive or exceptional. It did not define their service, or alter the course of the campaign. Yet it remained part of their accumulated understanding of infantry combat, that outcomes were often shaped less by grand maneuvers than by the interaction of small factors: weather, terrain, equipment, timing, and restraint. In the weeks that followed, the campaign in Italy continued with the same slow intensity. Units rotated, advanced, and held under similar conditions. Weapon malfunctions occurred elsewhere, sometimes with greater consequence, sometimes without. Reports continued to balance doctrine with reality, emphasizing control and cohesion over individual incidents. The ridge and the draw were eventually left behind as the front shifted. No marker recorded the brief engagements that took place there. The ground absorbed the traces of movement and fire, returning to stillness once the armies moved on. What endured was not a lesson formally codified, but an experience quietly carried. It reflected the cost of delay, not as a dramatic failure, but as an accumulation of pressure that narrowed options and increased risk. It showed how adherence to orders, necessary for coordination, could coexist uneasily with the demands of immediate judgment. For the infantrymen involved, the value lay not in recognition, but in survival and continuity. They returned to routine duties, adjusted by what they had observed and endured. Their actions did not reshape strategy, but they sustained it. Stories like this rarely appear in official histories. They leave no clear turning points or named outcomes. Yet they formed the daily substance of the war, experienced by countless small units whose work was measured in hours held and ground not lost. If this account contributes to a better understanding of those moments, quiet, constrained, and consequential in their own limited way, it serves its purpose.